much. What's it like? Is it surreal when you tweet out like China virus and then the president is kind of using that term days later? Is that surreal?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm just a kid from Chicago that didn't go to college, that started an organization on campuses, and now I have the leader of the free world using the two words that I thought would better describe the virus than some silly COVID-19 descriptor, because it actually puts blame where blame is due. And every virus that we've named in the last 100 years is actually the point of origination. It's not as if this is some sort of new concept. It's like we're going to carve out the one time we don't use the geographic point of origination, just so happens to be the country that owns half of our political leaders and the ruling class. That seems awfully convenient. It seems that every other outbreak, from Ebola, which I believe was a river in Africa, to West Nile, to every other virus, we basically use the place where it started. And actually, the president, I believe, based on independent reporting, found some inspiration on my tweet about that to mention that in a press conference. But yes, it's very surreal. I'm humbled by it. And even, I believe, a couple days ago or yesterday, he used the term China virus. And yeah, I just had it pulled up here on my computer. West Nile virus, guinea worm, Ebola, Zika virus, Rocky Mountain fever, SARS, even Lyme disease, all named after the geographic location, MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And it's not racist, it's not xenophobic. And then when he uses China virus, they freak out. I guarantee you that if it would have been West Virginia virus, no one would have cared. I mean, or if it would have been the Polish virus, no one would have cared. Or even the Egyptian virus. It just so happens that the one country that owns our entire ruling class and owns our media, they make a couple calls because it's making them look bad. Then all of a sudden they use the oldest trick in the book that they have. Well, that's racist. That's xenophobic. Why wasn't it racist to call it Ebola? That's kind of bizarre. And so, look, again, that's an act of the activist media. So yeah, it's awfully surreal, and it's something that I take very seriously, that the words that I put on Twitter can impact the leader of the free world.
While we're on this topic, what do you think was China's role in this, or how do you think that they should ultimately be, I don't know, talked to, prosecuted on this? And then while you're on the topic of China, you mentioned that they own the media, they own half our political influence. Can you talk on that?
Yeah, I mean, China's America's greatest enemy. I've been talking about this for years, under a lot of criticism and ridicule from people in the ruling class that benefit financially from China. Last year, I wrote a piece in Fox Business calling China America's greatest enemy, and I got more calls from senators and congressmen saying my language is a little too hot on China. I don't get those calls anymore. In fact, I get more people agreeing with me on that. China's been at war with us for 40 years. Maybe we should start to fight back. They deindustrialized our country. They basically shipped 10 million jobs overseas, and in exchange, we got piles of plastic that we fill our garages with that are basically useless garbage, and we ask people to take away 5 years later in garage sales. They're trying to rebuild our entire 5G infrastructure through Huawei. They built over 107 Confucius Institutes on our college campuses across the country, which are pseudo-military installations that even the highly ethical, questionable Christopher Wray has called a huge threat of China domestically, the largest threat of China domestically, where they have server rooms and CCP military officials that frequently visit these military installations on our college campuses. They build islands in the South China Sea in defiance to international orders and our wishes. They're still classified as a developing nation in the World Trade Organization, which allows them to compromise and be able to cut corners so that they can essentially ramp up production a lot quicker than we can, while we have to be under completely different environmental standards. They have 1 million Muslims in concentration camps, which should bother the American left, which doesn't. They say that they're really worried about Islamophobia. Well, if they're so worried about that, then why don't they care about the Uyghur Muslims? I always mispronounce that, so I apologize. 1 million Muslims in concentration camps in China. China's buying up ports of entry in Africa, in South America, and it's Uyghur Muslims. I apologize. I get that wrong. I always look at it phonetically, and so it's Uyghur Muslims, over 1 million Uyghur Muslims. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is a world domination strategy in Italy and all across Europe. And so at some point we have to realize that there's a difference. I have to say this first before I continue. There's a difference between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese people are being held hostage by the CCP tyrant, and they only represent about 5% of China. Now, that's not insignificant when you have a country that has 1.3 billion people. That's like 80 million people. So I don't want to say that that's insignificant. That's basically like 2 Californias. That is the CCP. But as a percentage basis, it's a minority. And so I have called for a complete and total shutoff with all trade and for us to start a new Cold War right now. It's time for a new Cold War. We shouldn't be afraid of it. We won the last one. We can win this one. We were lied to. We were lied to under this neoliberal promise that the more we trade with them, the more westernized they're going to become. That's incorrect. We were told that we could export our values to them. That never happened. We were told that the more we traded with them, they're all of a sudden going to embrace free speech and they're going to be wearing Levi jeans and eating McDonald's and listening to Kanye West and protesting for democracy in the streets of Shanghai and Beijing. The exact opposite happened. It only further emboldened the ruling tyrants to create a social credit system and score using our tech companies' technology so that they could monitor themselves through some sort of new age Orwellian 21st century Petri dish experiment that they might export to the entire Western world. They've shut down Hong Kong. Mike Pompeo, who's doing a terrific job, has now called Hong Kong no longer are they an autonomous entity or state. It's something of that variation.
Is that fight over, you think, in Hong Kong? You think that's over?
I'm sorry?
Do you think that fight in Hong Kong is over? I mean, it looks like a pretty sweeping move, this last one.
I mean, I don't want to be too dire about it, but we haven't stood with them the way we should. I mean, we shouldn't be trading with China, period, end of story. Yeah, it's going to cause higher prices and disruption in supply chain, but there's nothing they make that we need to survive. Nothing. There's nothing that we can't make here for a little bit more money. And so, for example, I did some exploring in the textile space. You can get an American-made T-shirt at cost for $3. You can resell it for $12 for the margins that are a little bit less for making in China. There's no excuse anymore. What do they make that we need? Nothing. People say, oh, we need to sell our stuff to them. Get used to lower profit margins. Maybe sell more stuff in India. I mean, or maybe sell more stuff in Southeast Asia. We are in a collision course at 40 years for a military conflict that no one's going to like. They hate us. The CCP does, not the Chinese people. I want to make that very clear. The Chinese people actually want freedom. A lot of them do. A lot of them are part of an underground Christian movement that's very promising. The freedom fighters have been waving American flags, and they have been under the thumb of the tyrant Mussolini equivalent Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping would have been best friends with Joseph Stalin, just so we're clear. And it's time for us to treat them like the malevolent force of the 21st century that we are. We are addicted to the cheap capital flow and the piles of plastic that they send us in return to America. It's either we love America or we love piles of plastic and the inflated profit margins that have been unrealistic for the last 20 years. I want our country back, and I want Western society to succeed. It's time for a new Cold War against China.